Well, today we are going to talk about two vehicles that are a study in contrast for 1971 in terms of luxury cars, and that is this beautiful 1971 Cadillac Eldorado, and we're going to compare it to this 1971 Lincoln Mark III. Now, the Eldorado and the Mark III were two of the predominant luxury cars and luxury coupes that you could buy in the event you were looking for a range-topping, comfy cruiser. The other vehicle that you could elect to procure would be the 1971 Imperial, which came in either coupe or four-door form. The Eldorado and the Mark III were only available as personal luxury coupes. Let's begin with the Eldorado. Now, Cadillac's Eldorado was all new for the 1971 model year, and this generation of Eldorado would last from 1971 through 1978. The front-wheel drive variant of the Eldorado was first introduced in 1967, and that would last through 1970. So this car was a follow-on to that particular first-generation front-wheel drive Eldorado. Now, one of the things that designers had a significant challenge with was the Eldorado shifted from its own E-body platform to still on an E-body platform, but one that was forced to share many more components with the full-size B-body General Motors cars. The 1970 Eldorado and the 1971 Eldorado are actually amazingly the exact same overall length. However, the 71 Eldorado just looks physically imposing and much larger than the previous generation car. And that's due to quite a few of the design elements that are different between the two vehicles. Now, as you look up front on the Eldorado, the 1971 Eldorado would sport the so-called bevel theme on the front and the rear of the vehicle. Notice that there's kind of this beveled surface that runs that entire length of the prow on the hood. And this was very typical Cadillac styling for the era, and in fact, luxury car styling. Cadillac had, especially on the Eldorado, that big bulge in the hood, the so-called power dome, in part because the 1967 Eldorado was actually going to get a single overhead cam V12 engine for a little bit before Cadillac engineers decided that they could get similar power out of the new upcoming 472 cubic inch V8, and it would be more reliable with less moving parts. And the 472 was really a great engine, so I can understand why Cadillac engineers just felt that there wasn't much marginal benefit to the single overhead cam V12. Nonetheless, that power dome hood, that prominent power dome, would stay as a styling cue, just to connote that the Eldorado had a significant sense of power. And by the way, from 1970 and into 1971, the Eldorado would be powered by an 8.2-liter 500 cubic inch V8, an enlarged version of the Cadillac 472 that was introduced in 1968. That 500 would be a high compression engine only for 1970. In 1971, unfortunately, it would become a low compression engine, and it would lose a little bit of horsepower as a result. And here we'll begin to walk around this Eldorado at the Eyes on Design event in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. Now, as we rotate around the car, you'll notice that there's this pretty significant plan view tapering of that midsection of the hood. By the way, the bumper center bar on the Eldorado and the DeVille and Calais and Fleetwood series were all shared. So they all have the same plan view or the same amount of point to the nose. But the Eldorado had that bevel theme, the others did not. And that was a big differentiator. I'm not sure that everybody necessarily appreciated it, but it looked good. Unfortunately, I will say that by this year, Cadillac had gone to a plastic grille up front, and the Mark III in the background that we'll talk about in a little bit did not have a plastic grille. It was still metal. Now, as we rotate to the side, take a look at that big cornering lamp up front, and then you'll note here on the styling, it's a little bit hard to see because this is a black car, but this was one of the earlier cars from GM Design that had the so-called Ford fendered look. And you'll see the rear so-called fender that's starting with that piece of bright work that's underneath the opera window. Well, that was because Bill Mitchell, during this time frame, General Motors styling vice president, was just enamored with cars of the true classic era. And of course, many of them had four fenders, and he was trying to do that again and resurrect that on these cars. Unfortunately, the Eldorado was so wide that you'll notice in this shot that you really can't see the four fenders as well as probably the designers intended, because the car was already 80 inches wide and then you'd have to put oversized load markings on it. Now here you'll see the bevel theme on this deck lid, and man, is that a deck lid. This was one of the most complicated stampings that General Motors Fisher Body Division had to engineer. And take a look at all the ins and outs between the so-called kind of bevel theme on the back, that by the way is continued in the bumper quite nicely, but then also the shoulders that come in from the outer edges of the car and kind of taper a little bit. You can almost imagine if you were to extend the deck lid rearward, you'd get a little bit of a boat tail, which was Bill Mitchell's another favorite of his. But you do have this crease as well that runs down the midsection of the deck lid. The 1971 Eldorado has a two-piece backlight, I should say, and that crease just continues up and over the car too. And look at how far those quarter panels extend rearward. It makes them look almost cartoonish or exactly like the sketch. This car looks immensely wide at the rear, and it's really pretty much the same width as the previous generation Eldorado that doesn't have the same look. And I think what's going on here is a couple things. One is that you have this kind of tapered rear end, and so it squishes the rear end down more visually and slims it. You have a relatively large section of bright work with the bumper that does the same, so that emphasizes the horizontal dimension. Then on top of that, you have this large kind of catwalk area in between that shoulder on the deck lid and the top of the quarter panel, which visually pushes the quarter panels outboard in terms of how you see them, especially since that feature, that catwalk feature, that area in between the shoulder and the top of the quarter panel is the widest at the rearmost part of the car. Overall, I have to say that while some don't necessarily care for the 1971 Eldorado as much as the previous generation, I really like it, at least in these dark colors. I think it just looks absolutely fantastic. How could one say that this black car is not captivating and just, well, I don't know. It's just a beautiful vehicle. The interior is a little bit of a letdown, but the exterior styling is really awesome. Let's continue walking around the car now. As we rotate around the car, you're going to see the deck lid vents that were on all 1971 General Motors products. This must be a late build 71 Eldorado because there's not that many louvers back there. As the model year would go on, the number of louvers would reduce as they found an increasing amount of problems with water intrusion, and it just didn't work as intended, that flow-through ventilation system that was supposed to exhaust on the deck lid. They would move it into the lock pillar for 1972. Now, we talked quite a bit about the styling, and I would just say as we walk around this car one more time, mentally remember this and then wait until we look at the Lincoln Mark III. This car has a ton of surfacing on the hood, on the body sides with that four-fender theme, on the deck lid. The Mark III is really the antithesis of that. It's kind of simple and architectural and linear, and this is anything but. This is a pretty extremely surfaced car and a beautiful one at that, and it would have even been more dramatic, like I said, if the designers had a little bit more width to work with, but they did not. In any case, the other thing that was fundamentally different, the Eldorado obviously was front-wheel drive, the Mark III was rear-wheel drive. The suspension on the Eldorado up front was a torsion bar front suspension, coil spring rear with a solid beam axle. The Mark IV would be 4 coil springs all the way around. And I will say that if you drive one of these 1971 Eldorados, the engine and the transmission are pretty much flawless, smooth, quiet, not necessarily fast, but tons of torque, and you're never really longing for power. But the overall ride in these is smooth, but I wouldn't say it's overly supple or refined compared to even some of the other General Motors vehicles of the era. The car rides a little bit stiff, and I would say it's a little bit jiggly in terms of the overall structure, and the road isolation isn't quite as good as the Mark III, but the handling is way better, in part because the torsion bars, you don't really have to wait. There's not a kind of a lag in between the suspension moving and them exerting resistance, and that helps with cornering, and one of the reasons why Chrysler used them all the way back to the 1957 model year. Boy, that rear three-quarter view is dramatic with that four-fendered theme. By the way, that little piece of bright work aft of the door that starts the rear fender was a throwback to the mid-50s Cadillacs that had something similar, and designers used it to kind of initiate that rear fender theme on this car. Now let's take a look at the interior, and I think this is kind of one of the disappointments of the 71 Eldorado, more because of the materials than the theme. You have this driver-centric theme, but that wood grain is all fake, and it's just a sticker. It's pretty depressing. Now notice Cadillac had these large headrests as well that were somewhat soft, but kind of made of hard plastic. They don't really deflect that much when you squeeze them, and they're pretty hard. I wouldn't want my head to whack them. It's not like one that's just softly padded. A little bit easier to see, but here you have the wraparound instrument cluster that was something that was a common feature of all the 71 GM full-size vehicles except the Caprice. See that big door pull strap back there? Those would pull out of the door panel often as people would yank on them. And then they would pull out from the door panel, and the dealer fix was to drill extra screws into the escutcheon that covers the pull strap there and the anchoring point. On the 73 Cadillacs, they got much beefier anchors as a result. The other thing I'll say here that you can see, that opera window, that was added at the last minute on the 71 Eldorado. This car was supposed to be a hardtop, and GM designers wanted to give it that opera window because the 73 Monte Carlo was coming out, and they wanted the Eldorado to introduce that feature such that when the Monte Carlo came out and it had that opera window, that people would think they were buying a baby Eldorado. And I guess it worked. The 73 Monte Carlo sold well. And that's the 1971 Eldorado. So how would I grade some of the major features of the car? Well, the engine and transmission, I would give the engine maybe an 8.5 to 9. The only reason I wouldn't give it a 10 is wish it had the same power as the 1970 high compression variant. Transmission, I would give a 10. I don't think it gets any smoother, more reliable than the turbohydromatic 425 under hood. Suspension, maybe about a 7, I would say, just because it's not as soft and the ride isn't all that great, although the handling is pretty good. Brakes, pretty good in this car, maybe an 8. I'm judging these, by the way, and giving scores based on other cars of the era, not modern cars. I give the brakes an 8. You did have standard front disc brakes by this time, single piston brakes, drum rears, but you would later get four-wheel discs on the Eldorado too. Exterior, I would give it a 9. I like the dramatic look of the 71 Eldorado. Interior, maybe a 5 or 6. I think that's really the letdown of the car, is the interior materials, especially for the price point. So there's a few little grades for you. And overall reliability, especially for the era when grading against the era, I'd grade it probably in a 9. The Cadillac engines were very reliable, very durable. Quadrajet carburetors, reliable, durable, kind of hard to beat. Maybe I should even give it a 9.5 in terms of reliability, because usually on these Cadillac V8s, the starters and water pumps were seemingly much more reliable than the Chevrolet V8s as an example. So, we'll rank it high. Let's move on to the Mark III. Now, 1971 was the last year of the Mark III. The car ran for the 1969, 70, and 71 model years. And the styling was getting a little bit dated by the time 1971 rolled around. In fact, it was kind of dated even when the car was introduced. It's not saying that it looked bad. It was just a handsome vehicle. And notice you don't see the same sculptural, surfaces on this Mark III that you do see on the 71 Eldorado. The body sides in particular look like, aside from the wheel arches, they were just formed by a template and kind of dragged across the car in kind of a uniform way. The wheel arches are rather sculptural and nice, where they initiate with a relatively narrow width and then terminate at the rear with a fatter width to them. But everything from that crease that runs the length of the car, that feature line, to the top of the fenders, which is extremely flat, very flat, so flat that in side view, almost looks like the fender is rising. Your eyes play tricks on you. And the front end, it does have that kind of power dome or bulge, but not as wide as the Eldorado, and also doesn't have the same, dramatic nature to the sheet metal from a sculptural perspective. As a consequence, the best way that I can describe the Mark III is that it's a handsome car. It's not necessarily a beautiful car. I think it's a good-looking car, but it doesn't have the surface development that the Eldorado did to any degree. In fact, it's rather pedestrian when you look at it from many angles. So let's walk around the car and begin to do so. Notice the body side here again. Really not much to speak about aside from the wheel arches. You take those wheel arches away and it's a very plain body side, very flat fender. You do have the auto-dimming lamp little bump there on the driver's side fender to sense the oncoming headlamps. Now this view here with the lighting really accentuates the wheel arches and the feature line that starts at the front of the vehicle, kind of just after the bumper, continuing the bumper form, and then runs all the way down the car, hopping over both of the wheels and forming the wheel arch. It's a nice line, but again, not too much other than that, and relatively stiff and upright body sides. Not too much curvature or nearly as much tumble home on this car as you saw on the 1971 Eldorado. Now, as we resume our walk around, you'll notice the high back seats for 1971 that you could get in your Continental Mark III. Could not get those in the 1969 or 1970, although the 1969s in particular did have some rather high backs. You'll also notice the new Lincoln logo there on the sail panel. That was new for the Mark III. The ventilation that's aft of the backlight, that actually works extremely well. So while the Cadillac for 71 had the vents in the deck lid that didn't work, this system actually worked quite well, although it would also get clogged with leaves and debris, and that would clog up the passages, and then you'd get the trunks rotting out. So it was a good idea, and it was very effective. If you were a cigar smoker, you could dissipate the smoke inside quite readily, while you had the windows up, by the way, too. Now, you, of course, have the faux kind of spare tire hump. That was a real spare tire hump on the 1956 and 7 Mark II. By the Mark III, it was just a styling element. And it is nice how it's integrated with the bumper and flows into the bumper. Now, you don't have that kind of extreme tapering like you had on the Eldorado, and as a result of that and some other elements, the rear end of this is wide, but it doesn't look nearly as wide as the 71 Eldorado did. Very nice tail lamps and kind of in the vein of the Mark II. By the way, this Mark III that was introduced in 1969 was the second Lincoln Mark III. The other Mark III was introduced in 1958. There was the Mark III 4.5 in 1958, 58, 9, and 60. And then Lincoln just kind of forgot about those cars, which was appropriate because they sold so poorly when they reintroduced this Mark III, really because this Mark III was designed in the vein of the Mark II. Now, one cool styling feature you did get on your Lincolns, which you didn't often get on the Cadillacs, except the 1967 and 8 Eldorados, the hidden headlights. Lincoln loved those and continued having hidden headlights for a number of years. Cadillac only had that on the Eldorado for 1967 and 1968. And now let's take a look inside, because this is where the Mark III really shines. Despite this being the final year of the Mark III, oh my goodness, look at the interior materials and the fit and finish in here compared to the Eldorado. Spectacular. That is real wood on the doors. Those high back bucket seats just look rich and sumptuous. The dash, richly padded and absolutely fantastic material quality. Every switch in this car, every little thing that you touch just has a rich feel to it. Even the door locks in this are vacuum operated door locks. You push the door lock button, you hear a little psh of air releasing. If you push the power door lock in the Eldorado, it sounds like the cell block is unlocking. GM, for whatever reason during this time frame, some of the loudest power door lock actuators. The climate control in here, the controls there on the left and then the radio on the right, they just feel, when you use them, they feel hefty. The controls feel hefty and substantial. Not so in the Eldorado, where they feel plasticky and kind of tinny. By the way, is an oxymoron. Can't be plasticky and tinny at the same time, but they feel cheap. How's that? That's a much better way to describe it. And as we walk around the car one more time, I'll describe some of the other features and how I would grade the components on the Mark III. Well, the components overall, the engine and the transmission, I would grade the engine, the premium fuel 460, I'd give it a 9. It's quite nice. Maybe an 8.5. Not quite as nice as the 500. Very torquey. Very smooth, but again, not as smooth as the Cadillac V8, so maybe an 8.5. The transmission, the C6, very reliable, rugged, but not as smooth shifting, pretty jerky, in fact, compared to the Turbo Hydromatic 425, so I'd give that an 8, maybe a 7.5. The ride on the Lincoln, I would give, in the suspension, I would give a 7, I would say. The ride is spectacular. The handling is wallowy at best. It's just wallows continuously. The steering is not nearly as nice either in the Mark III as the Eldorado. I would give the steering gear in the Eldorado a 9. It's pretty phenomenal. No road feel, but so what? It really does have a nice way about it in terms of you piloting the car. I would give this comparable steering gear in the Mark III a 5, maybe a 4. It's just slow with zero road feel. At least the GM had some, but very slow ratio as well, despite the power steering. The exterior styling I would give on the Mark III a 7.5. The interior I would give a 9, maybe a 9.5. It's one of the most sumptuous and richest interiors of any domestic car, and you even get, just like the Eldorado, these little fiber optic lamps. See that little thing sticking up in the middle of the backlight there? That's on the inside of the car. Those are lamp monitors for the rear lamps. The Eldorado would get monitors in the fenders for the headlamps, the turn signals, and the bright lights. Now, aside from the styling, one huge differentiating feature between the Mark III and the Eldorado is the ride and the overall level of refinement. Despite this being the final year for the Mark III, the level of refinement and the fit and finish and the quality, I would just say, was way beyond what the Eldorado could achieve. Lincoln used to use sheet metal that was made by the Budd Company because it was such a precise level of fits with the body. Notice the gaps. Like, we're walking around this car, the gaps are close and tight. The Eldorado, not so. It's just kind of thrown together. In fact, take a look at this area on the Eldorado in particular, where the fender and the door and the hood come together. On almost all of them, they just don't fit that well. The stamping quality and the care with which the Eldorado was put together, well, it just was not even close to the Mark III. If I had to grade the overall quality of the automobile, I'd put the Mark III at a 9.5. I'd put the Eldorado at a 5.5 to 6. It's really that bad. Cadillac was selling all that they could build back during this time frame, and they sped up their line speed at the Clark Street assembly plant to, I think, 72 jobs per hour versus the normal 55 to 60, and it really just showed. The cars were not put together with the care that they once were. So overall, which car would I have picked if this were 1971 and I wanted a true luxury car? Well, after driving the Mark III, I would have had to have picked it. Didn't look quite as nice, but the interior was much richer, and the overall car was just put together with such a higher level of quality than the Eldorado. I guess I probably would have had to have gone with it, despite the fact that I think the powertrain on the Eldorado was a little bit better and it had front-wheel drive. This one would have been my choice over the Imperial as well. So what do you think? What would you have picked? And do you like how I've kind of graded the cars and helped you with what's good, what's not? Let me know. Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.